So when shelter in place first began, we did have a lot of barriers to accessing the court in the beginning. Mostly it was for unrepresented litigants, which means people that don't have an attorney and people who do not speak English. So for them to access the Access Center or court services and obtain any advice or any help or information or paperwork, they had to speak English in order to access those services because the phone number, the voicemail, and the individual who answered the phone was only an English-speaking individual. So those were barriers to access. In addition, there's just been significant delays. Everything takes longer. Court hearings were pushed out significantly. DV survivors don't just need protection in the form of restraining orders. I also represent survivors of domestic violence in their divorce cases, child custody cases, child support cases, and immigration cases, certain immigration cases related to domestic violence survivors, affirmative cases only. And in some of those instances, a survivor might need access to income or finances, might need an enforcement motion, and courts were not hearing all of those matters. So a lot of survivors were delayed in receiving any adjudication on their cases. Some are still waiting today, and some, we believe, who didn't have attorneys maybe stopped trying to access services. If they didn't have an attorney helping them, the barriers were insurmountable, and we don't know how many people are without help and services because they didn't even know how to access it. And I think there's just a very important distinction to be made for people who have attorneys and people who don't have attorneys. I think other ways in which the court system and law enforcement, in my opinion, have been failing survivors is we don't have adequate implicit bias training for bench officers. We don't have adequate implicit bias training for officers that respond to the scene in domestic violence cases. I think it's really important for there to be this kind of mandatory training for judicial officers and for all police officers. Culturally sensitive responses to survivors of domestic violence is critical. Some people who are undocumented are, of course, not going to feel comfortable sharing the details. Some individuals from different cultures are comfortable sharing details in a different manner than in another culture. And I think that the bias that survivors encounter when they enter the courtroom is significant and affects everyone's case. That's a long-term issue. That's not specifically a COVID issue, but it is significant, ongoing, and I think progress needs to be made if we really are going to help survivors of domestic violence in the community. I have to be honest, most of my cases are not prosecuted. My clients file police reports and no prosecution is ever pursued. My clients typically don't end up feeling that they have the support from the police department when they report TRO violations or when they report domestic violence incidents and are seeking enforcement of some kind, whether that be removing the abuser from the household, an arrest, or a criminal case if that's what they're choosing. My clients don't typically report responsiveness from the police department in those respects. So those are challenges that I think we're seeing in terms of accountability.